I'm very happy to be with you in your morning, my evening here in the US. And I'd like to share with you a little bit about the journey that we've been on and some of the insights that we have gleaned. I am a neuroscientist by training, and I began my career with a very simple question. And the question is, why is it that some people are more vulnerable to life's challenges and other people more resilient? And in the early part of my career, I focused a lot on the vulnerability side of the equation. I studied the brain mechanisms that conferred vulnerability to anxiety and depression and stress reactivity. And then over some period of time, it became clear to me that it was important to pay equal, if not greater, attention to the positive attributes, because it is through cultivation of these positive qualities like kindness and compassion and mindfulness that we can really promote human flourishing. We hold the view, as does many other entities such as the World Health Organization, that health is not simply the absence of illness. And so it is something more. And we use the term well-being to broadly capture the qualities of human flourishing of which we are all capable. And we've been inescapably led to a very simple conclusion, which is, I think, the title that I chose for this talk, which is that well-being is a skill. Well-being is a skill. It's a skill in the sense that other endeavors are also skills. And one of the things we know about skills is that you can become better at the performance of the skill if you practice. And the same is true for well-being. So if you practice, you will be able to improve your well-being no matter where you start from. And so one of the really important insights from modern neuroscience that all of this work is predicated on is the insight that there are two fundamentally different forms of learning. One form of learning we call declarative learning, which is learning about the value of things, conceptual learning. So we can learn the value of mindfulness, but as we all know, that will not necessarily make us a more mindful person. We can learn the value of honesty, but that will not necessarily make us a more honest person. We can learn about the value of kindness, but that will not make us a kinder person. There is a second form of learning that we call procedural learning. Procedural learning is skill-based. It is acquired through practice, and it is represented and instantiated in completely different brain circuits compared with declarative learning. And in order for optimal transformation to occur, in order for well-being to flourish, we need both forms of learning. So this is something very, very important. And really, it is a point that I don't need to make to the mindfulness community, because you all appreciate how mindfulness is something that can be cultivated through practice. But one of the points that I do want to invite you all to consider deeply is that mindfulness is a really important ingredient for cultivating well-being, but not the only ingredient. And so what I will share with you this evening is a framework for understanding the plasticity of well-being. That is the notion of what are the core constituents of well-being that can actually be cultivated through training. And as we'll see, mindfulness is one of them, but it's only one. And in order to produce optimal human flourishing, we need all of them. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. before I get to that, I want to spend a little bit of time on two other important issues. One is simply to underscore how urgent this activity, this enterprise, this endeavor, this project, if you will, is. Even before COVID, the world was on a trajectory that was not a particularly healthy or sustainable one. Rates of depression, of anxiety, of suicide, of loneliness have been increasing in many, many different parts of the world. And these increases have been exacting a devastating toll on our populations. COVID has only accentuated these problems. And so this we consider to be an urgent public health need. That is, the cultivation of well-being is an urgent public health need. And we need to harness the available resources, the different entities, partners, governments, to bring about the change that will be required to increase the well-being of humanity. And I'll say more about that toward the end of my talk, but I simply want to underscore that at the beginning and to suggest that what we're going to be considering this morning is something that really is core to the very future, the very sustainability of humanity as we know it today. Before now I talk about this framework for understanding well-being, I wish to share with you some of the key insights in modern science that have provided a critical foundation for this work and allow this work to go forward. And this is work that has been conducted over the last decade for the most part, and represents some really fundamental insights in modern science. The first of those insights is neuroplasticity. This is a word that I'm sure most people who are participating in this conference have heard of before. By neuroplasticity, we use that term to simply indicate that the brain is constantly changing. It's constantly being shaped by experience and by training. Most of the time, our brains are being shaped unwittingly. That is, most of the time, our brains are being shaped by forces around us over which we have little control and of which we're typically only dimly aware. The invitation in all of this work is that we can actually more intentionally change the brain. And here's the remarkable fact. Science shows that when we train our mind using mindfulness and other kinds of practices, our brains actually change. And those changes in the brain are the changes that enable these qualities to endure over time. When we sit down to practice mindfulness or other contemplative practices, we're not sitting down to get some experience during the practice, some pleasant feeling during the practice. That's not why we practice. The reason why we practice is the impact that these practices have on every other aspect of our lives. And this is really such an important issue and is the result of the neuroplastic changes that are induced by this kind of training. So the second theme that I'd like to introduce is an equivalent of neuroplasticity in the realm of genomics. And this is epigenetics. Epigenetics is the science of how our genes are regulated. We all have a sequence of base pairs which constitute our DNA. And for the most part, that will not change over the course of one's lifetime. But what will change is the extent to which any gene is turned on or turned off. You can think of genes having little volume controls that range from low to high. And the setting of those volume controls is highly dependent on our circumstances, highly dependent on our demeanor, on our emotional life, and on training the mind. We know, for example, that the way a mother behaves toward her offspring can actually induce epigenetic changes in the offspring, which can persist for the whole life of that individual and even be passed down 1 or 2 generations. The actual biological mechanisms through which those experiences are embedded and encoded is beginning to be understood in modern molecular science. And this is a very powerful insight and helps us to appreciate and understand how training the mind may induce epigenetic change, which then is the substrate, if you will, for more enduring change that can occur. So I've mentioned neuroplasticity and epigenetics. I'd like to talk about 2 other themes or insights from modern science that are very, very important and highly relevant to our discussion this morning. The third theme is an increased understanding of the bidirectional pathways by which the brain and mind communicate with the body. We know that our minds are embodied, that activity in the body can influence the mind, and activity in the mind can influence the body. The specific signaling, the pathways, the neural highways through which these interactions occur are beginning to be understood in modern science. Now, why is this relevant and important for our considerations this morning? They're relevant and important because we know from hard-nosed epidemiological research that people who report higher levels of well-being are physically healthier. Now, this is not true of everyone, but if you look at large populations, if you look at tens of thousands of people in large population studies, this is indeed what you find repeatedly. And this leads to the conjecture that training our mind to cultivate well-being will induce changes in the body that will promote not just mental health, but physical health as well. And if that's really true, it's quite revolutionary because it would suggest that training our minds are going to be an important pathway for optimal health. And if all of that is true, it should lead to decreased healthcare utilization, decreased healthcare costs, and ultimately be economically beneficial. And every corporation on the planet will want some of that if indeed that turns out to be the case. And I don't want to oversell what we know through modern science today, but all of the indicators are pointing in that direction. So I've talked about neuroplasticity, I've talked about epigenetics, and I've talked about the bidirectional pathways by which the mind and body communicate. There's a fourth theme that I want to mention. And in many ways, it's the most controversial of these 4 themes, yet there is a very rigorous and growing corpus of scientific evidence to support it. And this 4th theme I label innate basic goodness. Innate basic goodness. And by this I mean that every human being comes into the world with a propensity for goodness, with a propensity for kindness, for pro-social behavior, so that if that individual is given a choice, she or he will choose the pro-social alternative. And in this sense, we think about kindness and we think about compassion in the same way that scientists think about language. We know that we come into the world with a capacity for language. But in order for that capacity to be expressed, we need to be raised in a normal linguistic community. And we know from case studies that have been reported in the scientific literature of some children raised in the wild, feral children, they don't show normal language development. And in the same way, we think the same is true for kindness and for compassion. That is, we need to have these innate seeds nurtured in order for them to be expressed. And this is where training the mind becomes so important. So I've talked about 4 important themes in modern science. I've talked about neuroplasticity, epigenetics, the increased understanding of mind-body-brain connections, and the 4th is innate basic goodness. Those themes, those insights, provide a very important foundation for the work that we have been doing over the last 15 years on the impact of training the mind on the brain, the body, and mental and physical health. And I want to now share with you an important framework that we've developed. And we've published this framework over the last year. And it is a framework which is guiding a lot of our current understanding and insights into well-being. This framework is focused on the plasticity of well-being specifically. And by that, we want to emphasize that what I'm about to describe are core elements or pillars of well-being that scientific research shows exhibit plasticity, meaning that we can train them, we can exercise them, we can cultivate them, and through that, we can improve our well-being. So what are these 4 pillars? Some of them I think you'll see are quite obvious, others may be less so. The first pillar of well-being we call awareness. Awareness is where we would put mindfulness. And it's so important. And it's interesting that the favored typologies for understanding well-being in the West have typically not included awareness as one of the elements. And yet, from the contemplative traditions, particularly the Asian contemplative traditions, we clearly recognize the importance of awareness. And we call it awareness because it includes a number of different components. One is our capacity to regulate our attention, to focus our attention, so important. Another is our capacity for what we scientists call meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is knowing what our minds are doing. How many of you think that you know what your minds are doing? Of course, that is a rhetorical question. If we were alive, I would ask for some volunteers to answer. It turns out that we don't always know what our minds are doing. And let me give you one example that I think many people have encountered in their lives. Certainly I have. People have reported, many people, and there's been a lot of scientific research on this, that a person can be reading a book where she or he is reading each word on a page, and they may be going along one page, a second page, and after a few minutes, they realize that they have no idea what they've just read. Their minds are somewhere else. And then the moment they recognize that, that is a moment of meta-awareness. It's a moment of awakening. And simple mindfulness practices can cultivate this quality of meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is so important. We believe that meta-awareness is a necessary condition for all other forms of transformation, of personal transformation. And so this is why the practice of mindfulness is so important for cultivating well-being. But as I alluded to very early on in this talk, it is not the only component. So what is the second component or pillar of well-being in this framework? The second pillar of well-being we call connection. And connection refers to the qualities that are important for healthy social relationships. Qualities like kindness, like gratitude, appreciation, compassion, empathy, all of those would fit under the rubric of connection. And we know that connection is so important in our world today, particularly during COVID. One of the things that I've commented on is the unfortunate choice of phrase that our public health officials across the world have chosen for what they ask us to do during the height of COVID, which is to be socially distanced. And really what we're being asked to do is to be physically distant, not socially distant. It turns out that you can be physically distant and socially connected. And in fact, one of the wonders of modern technology is just what we're doing right now, which enables us to remain connected even though we are not physically in proximity. Research in the US that was done just before COVID showed that 76% of the United States population reported themselves to be either moderately or significantly lonely. We also know that loneliness is more than twofold a risk factor for mortality than is obesity. So this is hugely important. And this gets under the skin, so to speak, and affects our biology in ways that are important, not only for our mental health, but for our physical health as well. We in our laboratory have conducted scientific research showing that even really short-term practice, and here we're talking about not more than 2 weeks of practice, just a few minutes a day, can significantly change the qualities that are part of connection and can actually change the brain. Now, it's not to say that those changes in the brain will necessarily endure. We don't think they will actually, unless a person continues to practice. But we've shown that we can see changes in the brain with as little as 2 weeks of practice. And that's pretty amazing and underscores how flexible, malleable, plastic our brains really are. So I've told you a little bit about awareness and about connection. Let me now share with you the third pillar of well-being. The third pillar of well-being we call insight. And insight is about a deep experiential and a curiosity-driven understanding of how our construction of ourself, how the narrative that we all carry around about ourselves, how our beliefs about ourselves, our expectations of ourselves, how that shapes how we experience the world. And when we begin to have this deep experiential understanding, we can loosen the grip that these beliefs and expectations have. And when we loosen the grip, it turns out our well-being dramatically improves. And one of the qualities that this is particularly important for is resilience. So We know that there are people on one end of a continuum who have a lot of negative self-beliefs. They have a low self-esteem. They don't value themselves. And we know that these negative self-beliefs and expectations are a prescription for depression. These are individuals who are at significantly increased vulnerability to depression. And one of the key insights from the scientific research that has been done in this area is that what's most important initially is not so much to change our narrative, but it's to change our relationship to the narrative. Most of the time, we're not even aware of this narrative. Most of the time, we have no insight into how this narrative is shaping our experience of the world. And being able to really taste it, to see it clearly, is a very important step toward the cultivation of well-being. So I've talked about awareness, connection, insight. What is the fourth pillar of well-being? The fourth pillar of well-being we call purpose. Purpose is about finding one's true sense of direction in life. It's not so much deciding that I'm going to do something more purposeful. Rather, it's discovering the purpose that's already embedded in one's life, and most importantly, aligning more and more of our everyday behavior around this sense of purpose. So can you envision that more and more of what you do every day is part of your sense of purpose, is imbued with your core values? Can you imagine that washing the dishes, cleaning your house, doing the laundry can all be meaningfully related to your sense of purpose? So it's, again, not so much about trying to find something, quote, purposeful to do, but rather infusing our everyday activities with this sense of purpose. One of the amazing things that we know is that people in their 7th and 8th decades of life who have a strong sense of purpose are people that end up living considerably longer. It turns out that having a strong sense of purpose is the single most important psychological predictor of longevity. And we can do a lot to cultivate our sense of purpose and to embed more and more of our everyday activities within this sense of purpose. So these are the 4 key pillars of well-being that show plasticity: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. All 4 are necessary for optimal human flourishing, not just one. If you did just one, it would be like going to the gym and just working out on your upper body. For a normal person, you would never want to do that. You'd want to exercise the whole system. This is about exercising all of the key pillars that we know from scientific research underlie our capacity to flourish. In our center, we have put this all in a program called the Healthy Minds Program, and we have an app that we freely released called the Healthy Minds Program. It is in English, but it is available all over the world. So if you're interested, you can go to the website, tryhealthyminds.org, all one word, tryhealthyminds.org. And I will actually put that in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see that, tryhealthyminds.org. You can go there and learn more about this program. So let me end these formal remarks by underscoring how urgent our need is for exercising and cultivating these qualities of the mind. Our vision is to disseminate this kind of practice or these kinds of practices in major sectors of our society. We're working with systems of education, with healthcare systems, with workplace settings, many different entities to bring these programs to those entities in order to promote well-being at scale. One of the things that we're doing with this app, which is freely available, is also collecting some data to enable us to capitalize on citizen science, if you will, so that we can improve our capacity to train these skills over time. One of the key questions, which we don't have an answer to yet from scientific research, but is so important, is this. We know from all of the studies that have been done in mindfulness and related areas that one size does not fit all, which is so important. I'm often asked, what's the minimum number of minutes per day that I should practice? Well, it probably is going to differ for different kinds of people. Moreover, let's say that you allocated 15 minutes to practice every day. Is it better to practice in one single 15-minute period, in 3 5-minute periods that you sprinkle over time, or maybe in 5 3-minute periods? The answer to that question is not known. Moreover, it's probably going to be the case that it will be different for different kinds of people. And then in order to cultivate well-being more generally, should we start with mindfulness? Maybe we should start with connection. Maybe we should start with insight. Maybe we should start with purpose. We don't know the answer to that. And again, it probably is going to vary with different kinds of people. And so one of the key questions that we are attempting to address today in our research is to deeply characterize people at the start, and then to determine which strategies are going to be most effective for which kinds of people. And this is really an extremely important question, because we know that a one-size-fits-all is not going to work. So those are some of the important, outstanding questions. And let me end by simply saying that the vision that I hold is a vision where we incorporate these practices in the same way that we incorporate other public health kinds of practices for our own personal physical hygiene. One of the things that I often remind people is that when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And I'll bet every person who's joining this conference brushes their teeth every day. Now, this is not part of our genome. We've figured out how to do this, and virtually everyone on the planet does it. I have the strong conviction that even if we practiced training our mind for as short a time as we spend brushing our teeth, that this world would be a different place. If every one of us made a commitment to do that every single day for the rest of our lives. So please join us on this journey. Please disseminate these practices widely, and thank you all so much for your attention.